What's good, Budapest? Oh, we gotta do that again. How's it going, Budapest? Better. B+. Good job. All right. Hi, my name is Vaidehi, and I want to kind of get a sense of the room. How many of you grew up hearing, oh, this is good. I'm not used to like looking up, but you are all here. I'm going to look up more often. All right. How many of you grew up hearing fairy tales as a kid? All right, good. That's good, because this talk probably is not going to make sense if you didn't, so I'm glad I bet on that. How many of you have heard the fairy tale Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Okay, most everybody. For those of you who haven't, quick plot summary. The story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears is basically that there's this girl named Goldilocks, and she breaks into a house in the woods. I don't know why she's in the woods, but she's there. And she breaks into this house, and it's totally abandoned, like nobody's at home. And it turns out this is the house of three bears. And she tries out all their stuff, like she sleeps in their bed, and she eats their porridge, and the Papa Bear's porridge is too hot, and the Mama Bear's porridge is too cold, and the whole story is her basically going through people's stuff, or bear stuff, and it's in retrospect, as an adult, I realize it's probably not a wise thing to teach children. If it was Goldilocks and the Three Bunny Rabbits, probably better, but Three Bears, I feel I don't know, I don't think that's the best thing. But needless to say, I did some research on Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and it turns out that this fairy tale dates back to the year 1837, so it's over 150 years old. And I got to thinking about what Goldilocks and the Three Bears would be like with a modern-day twist. If we were to tell that same story, what would that story be like? And that's what we're going to do today. So, modern-day Goldilocks. She doesn't break into houses anymore. She's over that. She learned her lesson. Instead, modern-day Goldilocks is a JavaScript developer, obviously, because why wouldn't she be? And modern-day Goldilocks is working at her first dev job, and she loves it. So she's writing JavaScript. She's working with frameworks like Angular and Ember and even a little React. And she's having a great time because she's learning a lot from the other developers on her team. And this company that she's working at, it's pretty small. She's the first junior developer that they have. And she gets to ask a lot of questions and learn a lot from these other developers by writing code that's in production, which is the first time she's ever done that. So that's really exciting. But after 6 months of being at this company, she realizes that there are definitely some places where this company has drawbacks. So after about 6 months, she starts wondering, am I actually getting better at writing code? I don't know. And she talks to other developer friends of hers. And she finds out that at other companies, one of the ways that a lot of junior developers realize that they're getting better or learn what they can improve on and get feedback is through the process of code reviews. So Goldilocks gets to thinking, and she realizes, we don't actually have any formal code review process at my company. In fact, whenever I want review, I have to ask another engineer to look at my code. And if I forget what I did wrong on a feature or something that I could have improved on, I don't have that feedback written down or documented anywhere. And she starts to think about whether this is going to be a long-term sustainable place for her to stay. And she realizes, after talking to other developers, that even junior developers on other teams can understand and learn from what senior developers are working on by reviewing their code. And at her company, they're not doing any of that. So it's not great. And after about a year or so, Goldilocks decides, I've learned a lot here, but it's time for me to move on. And she goes to her second dev job. So at her second dev job, things are different. And one of the things that's very, very different from her first dev job is the fact that they take code reviews pretty seriously. Every single PR that is made at this company on this engineering team is reviewed, which she's like, that's awesome. That's exactly what I was looking for. Now I'll finally get like the feedback that I need, and I'll learn, and I'll make fewer mistakes, and I'm gonna grow. It's gonna be great. On her first week at this new job, she's super excited because she gets to review the CTO's code. So now she's doing things that she couldn't do before. And this is really exciting. But after about 6 or 7 months again, she realizes that even this company has its drawbacks. They have code review processes, but it's small. It's a small team, it's a small startup, and really their process is just, as long as one person gives it a thumbs up, that code can be merged in. And like sometimes those PRs will devolve into like long discussions or many comments, and sometimes they're debating like, do we want to put a semicolon here? Should we use tabs and spaces? You know, those types of discussions. But the code review process is working fine, and they're merging code in. They're merging a lot of code in, and everything is fine, and it seems to be okay until one day. So one day, Goldilocks decides that she's finally ready to merge in this feature that she's been working on. And she's been working on it for like 3 weeks, and she's like, okay, good to go. She merges it in, and before she merges it, it's reviewed. It's reviewed by 2 other engineers on the team. And then she's like, okay, I'm gonna push this to staging, and I'm gonna go get a coffee. She gets back from getting her coffee, and 20 minutes later, she walks into the office, and everyone is having a minor panic attack, because the code that she merged in totally broke staging, and the entire environment is down. So everybody's like, Goldilocks, what did you do? What did you deploy? And she's like, I mean, you looked at the code. I don't know what I did wrong. We all reviewed it. But not to be deterred, Goldilocks sets out to try to put out this fire and figure out what she did wrong. As it turns out, she made a pull request with 2 files that were named the same, and one of them had code in it, and one of them was totally empty, and she meant to delete it, except she forgot to delete it, and nobody caught that. And then all of staging went down, and everybody freaked out. And when she sees this mistake, and she sees that nobody on her team caught this mistake, she gets to thinking. And she's like, oh no. We really thought that we had this code review thing down, but maybe we don't. And she realizes that these 2 teams that she's worked on, she's been looking for this perfect balance of which code review workflow works the best. And she doesn't really know if she's found it yet. So she does what probably all of us in this room would do in this situation. She asks the internet, and she does some Googling, and she hears about this really ancient book called Code Complete. And she starts thinking, oh my God, there must be a better way of doing code reviews, right? So she decides to dive into the theory of code reviews. And she opens up this book called Code Complete, which is so old, it dates back to the year 1993. So I mean like really old. And she reads a lot of the theory and research behind code reviews. Code Complete was written by a man named Steve McConnell. It's a really great book, and I recommend it to all of you to pick up. And he's done a lot of research in this book, Goldilocks finds. And it turns out that there are 3 different types of code reviews that came about in about the late 80s. And they're kind of the fundamental core of the code reviews that we do today, theoretically. And so she seeks to understand, why did we start doing code reviews and what are they good for? What is the ideal code review process supposed to be like? Because if I can understand that, then maybe I can bring it to my team and try to improve our process. So, in Code Complete, Steve McConnell writes this: one part of managing a software engineering process is catching problems at the lowest value stage. That is, at the time at which the least investment has been made and problems cost the least to correct. The idea that Steve McConnell kind of gets at in this book is that code reviews should act as quality gates for our code bases. Similar to if we create a product and we test it and we check its quality through Q&A or generic testing in general, code reviews should act as similar gates for our code bases. So she starts thinking about this, and she's like, I don't know if our team's code review process, like if our code review, our quality gates are actually of good quality. Sometimes it feels like we're just doing it as a formality. So she keeps reading, and she finds that the most effective code reviews, according to research, are the ones that are based on this idea of the collective ownership of construction, which is the idea that if all of us have a hand and all of us have an investment in our code base, and we feel like we're building it together, then code reviews actually improve the lifespan of our code base. So one of the examples that Steve McConnell gives is that if you have more sets of eyes on your code base through code reviews, this might seem obvious, but your code base will actually get better because you have more people looking at it. Another great benefit is the fact that if someone leaves your team, the rest of the team can still pick up and function. Because even if they haven't written the code that that person wrote who left, they've at least reviewed it. So they're somewhat familiar with the problems that they were working on and the features that they built. In a similar vein, being able to detect bugs and solve them is a lot easier for anyone on the team if you've reviewed code that you might have not necessarily written. These are cycles of defect correction. So when you identify something that's problematic in the code, whether it's a bug or a design flaw, and you can actually fix those things faster through code reviews. But what are the different types of code reviews? Goldilocks is sold. She's like, okay, all this theory seems great, but like, what different types of code reviews were created? Because she doesn't really know about the history of code reviews. As it turns out, one of the earliest instances of code reviews dates back to the 70s. And there was a small team at IBM that started implementing something called inspections. This was basically a kind of long-form code review where 3 people would come into a room, the person who wrote the code, the person who was reviewing the code, and a moderator, and all 3 of them would come in with this checklist of things that they had looked for and things that they were accountable while reviewing the code. And the idea was that you would look at the code and look for possible defects within it. So it might be design flaws or bugs or other things that might be problematic when you merge that code into the larger code base. And the idea was that you weren't trying to necessarily fix the code in that moment. You were just trying to look for gaping holes. So inspections were very long types of code reviews that took 30 to 60 minutes. But as Goldilocks found, there's another type of code review as well. And these are short reviews. Short reviews basically hinge on the idea that back in the 70s and even early 80s, a lot of teams were not reviewing code, and especially not reviewing code that was like 1 or 2 line changes. And Steve McConnell did some research on this, and in Code Complete, he writes about how teams that started checking code and reviewing it when it was under a 5-line change saw drastic results. So one of the examples he gives is that there was a team that had a 55% error rate in their code base. And they started implementing short reviews, where even if it was a 1-line change, they would make sure that code was reviewed. And that team went from a 55% error rate to a 2% error rate, which is kind of wild if you think about it. In a similar vein, there was another engineering team that had an 86% correctness rate. And once they implemented short code reviews, they went from an 86% correctness rate to 99.6. So this was kind of a game changer in the world and the theory of code reviews like 30 or so years ago. The third type of code review that she reads about sounds similar to things that she's experienced with senior engineers on her team. And this is something called a walkthrough. Walkthroughs are basically working meetings. So the idea is that you have like a senior engineer and maybe a more junior or mid-level engineer, and the two of them sit down and they talk about the design decisions made in a code change and things that could possibly go wrong or things that maybe could be reconsidered or refactored in a different way. In Steve McConnell's research, he found that walkthroughs aren't as effective, but they can have some benefits. They can reduce up to 30% of errors in programs, but they're more learning opportunities than opportunities to actually find tons and tons of bugs in your code. And as she's reading, Goldilocks stumbles upon something called the Peerreview sophistication scale. And this is something that has been around since the late 70s and early 80s, back when code reviews were kind of getting formulated. And the idea was that any engineering team could look at this and kind of self-assess where they fell on this review sophistication scale. And as Goldilocks looks at this, she starts thinking, I don't think I've ever worked on a team that's been a 4. Probably not even a 3. And she's like, is it just me? Has everybody else got code reviews down? Or is everyone else feeling the same discontentment with code reviews? And she's read a lot of the theory, but she doesn't feel like she's able to debug what went wrong in her team's code review process. So she decides to take theory and build on it one level further. She decides to actually figure out what code reviews are like in the industry in practice. So she does what most of us would do. She asks the internet. Specifically, she asks Twitter, which sometimes goes well and sometimes does not go well. But she basically asks everyone, hey, I'm collecting data on code reviews. Can you tell me what you think? And what she finds is really interesting. So she starts looking at this data, and a quick disclaimer about this data. She is not a data scientist. So it's obviously not a great representation of the entire industry. For one thing, people who answered the survey are only going to be people who saw her tweet and self-selected into it. But it's still better than nothing, so she decides to see what she can learn from this data, even if it might not be the most accurate. It's a start. So the first thing she finds is that the majority of people who answered her survey worked in Java, in Ruby and Rails, and in JavaScript. And she asked them a few qualitative questions and a few quantitative questions. So the first thing she asked was, have code reviews personally made you a better developer? Because you can't really assume that it's helped everybody. So she wants to be sure. And it turns out most people tended to agree with her. The average answer for code reviews have made me a personal developer on a scale of 1 to 10 was about an 8.6. So it seemed like most people felt like code reviews were a good thing for them personally. And she saw that most people found code reviews beneficial to their entire team. And the interesting thing about this was that it wasn't like just JavaScript developers or just Java developers or Swift developers. Everybody seemed to agree that having code reviews on their team was a good thing for the entire team and their code base. However, she did notice that most people had engineering teams that had code reviews as a requirement, but there was still around 10% of people who had to request review. So it's not like all teams had code reviews as a formality. There were still some teams that were merging code without ever actually having it reviewed. But it was interesting because her data seemed to suggest that it didn't really matter what language or framework you worked in. Rather, whether your team implemented code reviews as an actual part of your workflow or whether they didn't, had nothing to do with your language, and instead, everything to do with your team dynamics. Your framework has nothing to do with how well your code review process is actually contributing to your code base, but rather it's you and your teammates, was Goldilocks' guess. Interestingly, she found that most teams only required one person to actually review the code. There were some teams, maybe around 27%, that said, I need 2 to 3 people to review my code, but for the most part, one person was enough. But people could wait up to 5 to 20 minutes, or even sometimes like up to an hour, spending that time to actually review code. For the most part, though, no one was spending more than an hour really reviewing a pull request. People didn't really want to spend too much time. They wanted to do it very quickly. And it seemed like most people had to wait a few hours until code was actually reviewed by one of their peers. So people weren't spending too much time reviewing, but people had to spend a decent amount of time waiting for someone else to review. All of this qualitative data, or quantitative data, was fine, but Goldilocks was really interested in reading the results of her qualitative data. So part of her survey was asking very broad, open-ended questions. And the responses that she got from other developers were really interesting. She started reading through the responses, and she saw that there were two main things, two main characteristics that would either make or break a code review. And these two characteristics can kind of be summarized as energy and substance. So, when we say energy, what do we mean? Well, energy really boils down to who is doing the code review and how much time are they spending on it. It seemed like a lot of people would either hate their code review process or love it based on the amount of energy that was spent on the code review workflow. One developer wrote in and they said, "It's not just the act of doing a code review. Everyone on the team should receive equal review. I feel like it's so common for senior people to get no feedback because people assume they can do no wrong. They totally can. And senior people might want feedback. Junior people get nitpicked to death, and people forget that self-esteem is likely to be affected, and people are being vulnerable when they submit a code review." Someone else wrote in and they said, "Code reviews need to be acknowledged as first-class citizens. In a dev team, they need to be a legitimate activity that requires time and focus." And it was interesting because it seemed like some people on certain teams really felt strongly about code reviews and other people didn't. And that would very much leave a sour taste in their colleagues' mouths. One person wrote in and said, "We have one developer who blindly thumbs up every pull request and rarely leaves comments. They're trying to game the rule of at least 2 approvals, and it's easy to tell because inside of 1 minute, they've approved 2 to 3 pull requests." Someone else said, "The second and third people to review a PR are more likely to have a rubber stamp of approval after seeing someone else without actually reading the code." So, some of the overarching themes that Goldilocks noticed was that things like very large commits or very large PRs with no context would make people more likely to give a thumbs up without actually reading the code. And things that really, really got under some developers' skin was the fact that not everybody on the team was reviewed equally. Unequal reviews seemed to be a theme that came up again and again in her survey data. And there were a lot of developers who wrote in and said, "I want to do code reviews more, but our upper management doesn't think that they're important. And they're like second-class citizens, so we can't spend the time that we want to spend reviewing code." Goldilocks kept reading, and she saw that the idea of substance was something else that came up a lot. So when we say substance, what we mean is, what exactly are people saying or doing while reviewing? It's fine if everybody reviews and is reviewed equally, but what they're saying and how they're saying those things really matters. So one developer answered her survey, and they said this: "If I ever find myself going back and forth on something in comments on a pull request, I'll ping the other person and ask them to pair. Sometimes it's just really hard to talk to someone." Another developer wrote this: "We need to review the code and not the person. We should let tools handle styling changes for us so that we as a team don't need to spend time on this." And another developer wrote in and said that on their team, people actually trolled each other's code in pull requests. And there was no code of conduct, so there was no way to enforce if people were actually being kind to one another or not. And what was really interesting was, as she read through some of these comments, she just did like a quick find and file through all of her survey data. And she saw that around 5% of people who responded actually used the word nitpick when talking about code reviews. They had such a negative reaction to people picking on their code and doing it in a really unkind way. So some of the themes that she took away was that people got really, really frustrated and irritated when pull requests would turn into lots and lots of comments. And it seemed like people would rather just have a conversation with another human rather than leaving comments on a pull request. The nitpicking thing came up again and again, and it seemed like pull requests that turned into a free-for-all where everybody's focusing on style and syntax was just generally something that was going to lead to a really negative code review experience. And this was particularly the case for people who were more junior or new in the field. But the biggest one was developers who wrote in anonymously and said, all of my negative experiences with code reviews have stemmed from situations when someone has been egotistical and couldn't see empathy, whether they were the one being reviewed or they were the one doing the reviewing. So, as Goldilocks looked through all this data, she realized that there was kind of a disconnect between the theory of code reviews and what was actually happening in practice. And the disconnect was that nobody was talking about what was being done in practice and whether it was actually working. People were going through the actions, and a lot of teams were implementing code reviews, but based on all of this data from engineers who worked in all these languages, a lot of people weren't happy with it. So there was this strange disconnect between what code reviews were meant to be and how they were actually functioning in the industry today. And the biggest problem she saw was that nobody was talking about it. She had felt so alone in her own team that she thought it was just her. But now she realized it wasn't. It was all the people around her, too. So, I started this talk by saying that this is a fairy tale, and this is modern-day Goldilocks. I haven't been entirely honest with you because I'm Goldilocks. Surprise! These days, I actually don't work at either of those two companies. I work at a company called Tilda in Portland, and we build a product called Skylight, which is a profiler for Rails applications. But some of you might know Tilda as the creators of Ember. And to tell you the truth, since we're being honest, I don't actually know if we've got our code review process down. I'm sure there are things about it that are still problematic. But what I do know is that every single person on our team feels comfortable talking about it. In fact, one of my colleagues actually submitted an RFC to totally change our code review process because they were so frustrated with the way that it was working. They were like, we should do this differently. And they wrote a proposal, and everybody in our company looked at it and reviewed it, and we ended up changing how we did code reviews. And it's something that we still discuss often whenever it comes up as a point of contention. So, based on all of this research that I collected, and all of the things that I've learned about code reviews over this past year, I wanted to share a couple things that I've learned are small wins that you can do, that you can take back to your team, and a couple big ones too. So let's start with the small stuff first. A really easy way to make your code review process better is by using commit hooks. So I recently learned about something called Husky, which I haven't actually used, but I've heard good things about, which allows you to basically create commit hooks so that things like running tests or linters or anything that needs to happen before creating a pull request, even before making the pull request, before you commit, you can make sure all of those little things are taken care of so that you never have a pull request that devolves into comments about how something didn't happen that should have happened before the pull request was made. Another small win, GitHub has an amazing feature where you can actually create PR templates. So here's our PR template that we use. And side note, Awesome pull request is a terrible name. Don't ever name your pull request that. There's no context in that. But basically, all of the things that we expect every single pull request to have, we create that and add it as part of the template. My favorite thing about our template is the section that says, this pull request is required. Before you can merge it, the authors have to be proud of it, which I think is really important, acknowledging the positive things in a code review and in the code that's being added, not just the things that, could use some constructive criticism. Another great thing is using screenshots or GIFs. If you give your colleagues context of what's happening in your pull request, whether it's fixing a bug or adding a new feature, they're less likely to look like confused puppies when they're looking at your code, because you've given them all the context that they need. Linters. You should just use them. They're awesome, and you will never have a discussion about what syntax your team wants in a pull request, because you've already agreed upon what linter styles and what you want to adopt and not use ahead of time. So nobody ever needs to feel nitpicked. And your code review process can actually focus on larger things that don't involve things that could be fixed with a linter. Another great thing is encapsulating pull requests into smaller, bite-sized things. I like to think of how we're always talking about encapsulating code into like little, packages that are like small, contained, don't necessarily lean on a lot of other things. In a similar way, if you make a pull request that is encapsulated and provides context, it's a lot easier for people to look at this isolated thing, and then the barrier to entry for reviewing your pull request is a lot lower. People are going to be less likely to wait until the end of the day because it's an encapsulated small pull request with obvious commits, and it's a lot clearer for someone to see what you're trying to do. If you have a team that this actually can work for, having specific reviewers can be really awesome. So if you have specific reviewers, you can ensure that everybody on the team is actually getting reviewed and is being reviewed equally. And it helps distribute the workload so that it's never just one or two people reviewing code. Everybody is taking that on, and it really helps the idea of collective ownership of a code base. So, big wins. A lot of little things you can do, but these take a little bit more time, but in my opinion, they're really worth it. So, in reviewing everyone equally, part of that is pushing for a larger culture on your team where vulnerability is actually valued. This is hard to do because it involves changing the language you use in pull requests and in, even in conversations about code in Slack or something like that. It involves changing how you talk to each other on the team. And perhaps that it involves refocusing on reviewing a person to reviewing the code, which can be hard to do and takes time. But it's really worth it and can totally change the dynamic for everybody on the team, regardless of skill level. Developing empathy. So you saw an example of this in our PR template. But making a habit of calling out the good stuff in a code review is super important. A lot of the times, people feel that code reviews are just really negative and that you're putting yourself out there to be vulnerable, that people are going to jump on and attack all the things you did. But if you change the paradigm of your code review flow so that people are also equally calling out all the awesome things that someone did, they're going to feel more confident in being vulnerable with their teammates. Again, hard to do, but worth it. This one is the most important. Iterate. It's so important, I'll say it again. Iterate. And what I mean by this is start a conversation if you feel like your code review flow isn't working well. And if it's not working well after 6 months or things are going maybe not as smoothly as you'd like, have a conversation about it again. Maybe introduce a process where someone can write an RFC, or someone can anonymously send a message in Slack about something that might not be working for them in the code review process, or discuss it in your retros if you have them. The most important thing you can do, and the thing that I hope all of you will take away from this talk, is to have a conversation about whether your code review process is actually working. I hope you'll reflect on whether your quality gates are actually of good quality. Because if I've learned anything in researching and talking to other developers about code reviews, it's that a lot of us are unhappy when we're just not talking about it. So hopefully we will. And I think this quote, which somebody wrote into the survey, really summarizes it better than I ever could. They said, "I love code reviews in theory. In practice, they are only as good as the group that's responsible for conducting them in the right manner." The hard stuff about code isn't the code. It's the people who write the code. And code reviews are kind of the intersection of the humans who write the code and the code that they write. We could all do a little bit better job of making sure that we respect the humans that are involved in making software that we all consume and use. So, if you are interested in learning more about code reviews, or if you'd like to contribute to the survey, you can go to bettercode.reviews. And there's also a much longer, in-depth written version of this talk that you can go to at bit.ly bettercodereviews. And thank you so very much for your time. You've been an awesome audience.